There are hundreds of creatures lurking inside of Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time, from Trollocs to Myrddraal and even Oiga and Nim. Each one of them has been inspired by dozens of myths that have been so tightly woven together, it's almost impossible to pick apart each thread. But every so often, Robert Jordan gives something a name that makes mythology nerds like myself collectively pause and think, hang on a minute. Because the Golem isn't just an unusual fantasy creature from the Wheel of Time. Its name echoes one of the oldest and most enduring figures in Jewish folklore, the Golem. Now, whether that is deliberate, subconscious, or just another thread that we can count as being woven into the pattern, of course, I'll leave that for you to decide, because that is what this series is all about. Not about me telling you that X equals Y, but exploring the threads that may connect these stories and asking whether those connections are there at all. So, before we compare the two, let me tell you the legend of the Golem. Unlike many of the myths that we will or have explored, the story of the Golem isn't set in some distant age of gods and monsters. It's actually much closer to us. You see, the story most people know is set in 16th century Prague, although the idea itself is much older, with roots stretching back through Jewish mysticism, the Talmud, and the Kabbalah. In Hebrew, the word golem simply means unfinished, an unformed body, potential. Now, according to Abrahamic traditions, humanity once existed in a similar state before breath entered Adam, before consciousness, before the divine spark. There was only the earth, which Adam was crafted from. And that is where this story begins. Prague was home to a respected rabbi called Judah Lo ben Benzalel. Try saying that 5 times really fast. He's also simply known as Rabbi Lo and also the Maharal of Prague. Now, his community lived under a constant shadow. They were constantly victims of violence and persecution. They lived under this fear that simply existing was a death sentence. So the story tells us that Rabbi Lo turned not to swords, but to sacred knowledge. Because in Jewish mysticism, creation isn't simply an act of making something. Creation begins with the divine word. God speaks, and reality responds. Letters themselves could possess creative power. Names were not just labels, but they carried an essence. So one day, the rabbi walks down to the river Valtara and he gathers clay from the banks. Then he begins to shape that clay into the form of a man, towering, powerful, yet inanimate and silent. Then, through many prayers and the secret names of God, the figure begins to stir. Not with any flash of lightning or any triumphant roar, just life, or at least something that appears to be life. Because the golem exists for one purpose, and one purpose alone, and that is to protect. It has no childhood. It has no family. It has no ambition, no dreams of its own. It simply obeys for the purpose in which it was created for. Now, in many of the versions, the final act of creation is the use of the word met, which means truth. And that was carved across the forehead of the golem because it is said that what gave it life was truth. Now, other versions may tell this story just a little differently. Some speak of placing the sacred name of God inside the mouth of the golem on a small parchment that was known as a shem, because like every myth, even ones that are not that old, the details are going to change depending on who is telling the story. But the heart of it remains remarkably consistent. It's human hands and human tongue borrowing divine power to create life, or perhaps something that is close enough that the distinction begins to blur. And now for a time, it works. The golem guards the Jewish community. It patrols the streets. It keeps its community safe. It does exactly what its creator intended until something changes. Now, some versions say that the rabbi simply forgot to deactivate the golem before the Sabbath. And others say that the golem simply grew stronger with each passing day. The more it spent here amongst humans, the more its intention started to become more of its own. It was harder to control. It became less like a servant. But whatever the reason, the creation slipped beyond the creator's hand. And so the rabbi is forced to undo what has been done. And he does this by removing the first letter from the word emet. Emet becomes met, and met means dead. The golem collapses. Clay returns to clay, and as quietly as it came, it is gone, as though it had never lived at all, or perhaps as though it had. Well, strap in or strap on, because my white R-jar brain went very philosophical on this topic. I was not expecting to get this deep into this particular story, but this is a thought experiment, and we're going to go wherever the conditions lead us to go. So if the gummies have kicked in, now's the time to sit back, relax, and just let this all wash over you. If all Jordan had done was change the spelling from Golem to Gholam, I don't think it would be particularly interesting, because fantasy writers borrow names from mythology all the time. What's really fascinating about this particular story in comparison to this particular character and what it represents within the Wheel of Time is that Jordan seems to have almost reverse engineered it. He's turned it inside out. He's flipped it and reversed it. You see, the Golem, E-M, is at its heart a story about a creation in service to life. Whereas the Golem, A-M, we will figure this out, is ultimately a story about creation in service of death. You see, the Golem protects, but the Gholam hunts. The Golem is animated through names of the divine, whereas the Gholam is engineered by Agenor in some kind of imitation of creation itself. One exists to preserve humanity, and the other one exists to extinguish it. It's almost as though Jordan read this story, looked at it and asked, what would the shadow do with this? And honestly, from what I've explored so far, that does seem like a very Jordan-esque way of approaching mythology. It's not about copying it, it's about turning it. Almost as though the original story would exist on the other side of a portal stone. But then the more I sit with the story of the Golem, the more I realize it wasn't really asking me to think about the Golem or really any of Jordan's other constructs, but rather the reason and the purpose for which they're created and why. It's asking something much older, something that might even be considered a little bit more uncomfortable. What does it actually mean to create life? Not biologically, but philosophically and spiritually even. Because the golem looks human, it moves, it obeys, it fulfills the purpose for which it is created, yet almost every telling seems to insist on the exact same thing, that it's somehow not quite human. Not because it lacks strength or intelligence or even the ability to act, but because there seems to be some invisible boundary between something that imitates life versus something that truly lives. And that's where I think this story becomes even bigger than the Golem. Because even cultures that have been separated by oceans and languages and thousands of years, they do keep returning to this same question. Not simply, can we create life, but something even more fundamental. What actually is alive? Now, of course, this isn't a question that's unique to Jewish tradition or even the Wheel of Time for that matter. Civilizations have been asking this question for a really long time, and okay, you've convinced me, we're going to dive into them. As I mentioned earlier, in Genesis, Adam is formed from the dust of the earth. In some translations, the word dust is clay, mentioning it because it's important in reference to this topic, in my opinion. But ultimately, Adam's body is complete. His form is complete, yet Genesis recognizes that even in that state, he's not yet alive. He's not alive until God breathes life into him. Now, Gnostic traditions take this a step further, because Gnostic traditions state that even with breath, Adam is not truly alive yet. Animation doesn't equal life. What equaled life was knowledge, ultimately truth, an understanding of who Adam is. It's almost as if they're saying consciousness is just as important as breath when it comes to life. Now that then begs the question, what was the missing ingredient with the Golem? It clearly wasn't movement or form or even intelligence. It was able to think and it was able to act. So what was it that was missing? Now, thousands of miles away in a completely different civilization that's thousands of years apart, it's asking the exact same question. When we look at the sacred texts of the Maya, the Popol Vuh, it clearly states that the gods attempted to create humanity more than once. First, they attempted from mud and those bodies collapsed. Then they attempted to make humans from wood. Now, those people could walk, they could talk, they could work, but they ultimately possessed no heart, no joy for life, no gratitude for the gods. Only then do the gods fashion humanity from maize, which is the sacred substance from which all true humans can emerge. You might say that's pretty amazing. I'll show myself out. But here we have a different continent, a different civilization, thousands of years apart even. Yet they're all wrestling with that remarkably similar question. What transforms matter into a person? They're asking, was it the material or was it what that material could do? And the Greeks were wrestling with the same question too. Pygmalion carves a woman from ivory. She's beautiful and she's perfect. She looks like Linda Evangelista. She's still a statue until divine intervention in the form of Aphrodite comes and grants her life. Ultimately, it was Pygmalion's love that animated a statue into a living being. We even have Pinocchio centuries later echoing that very same tradition. He's not simply trying to move, he's already animated. He already can walk and talk and behave as if he's a real boy, but he recognizes that he's not a real boy because of the material that he's made from. But ultimately, it's his creator's fatherly love that enables him to become real. He becomes not just animated, but a person, suggesting that the two are not actually the same thing. And if we journey into ancient Egypt, we can see the way the people of Kemet even approached this idea as well. You see, temple statues would undergo a opening of the mouth ceremony. And this wasn't just some symbolic ritual. This was a literal invitation to invite the divine spirit into an inanimate object. Once the mouth was open, food and water, amongst other offerings, would be laid at those images on a daily basis. It was all about awakening something within that matter that was not there before. Yes, it's slightly different symbolism from a slightly different culture, but ultimately it's the same enduring myth. And it's not simply about when does something move, but it's asking, when does someone become someone? Once I asked that question, well, I couldn't help but see Robert Jordan's constructs in a completely different new light. Because you see, Agenor spends an entire age asking that exact question, only it's coming from the perspective of the shadow. You see, Agenor, more than anybody else in the Wheel of Time, seems completely obsessed with the act of creation. And now that I'm saying that out loud, no, I don't mean in the making babies sense. That's maybe refer to it as counter creation. The more you look at what he produces, the harder it actually becomes to draw a clear line between what is considered life in the Wheel of Time. Yes, I did warn you we were really going to get philosophical on this one. At first, it can seem simple enough. If we take something like Trollocs, for example, they were engineered by Agenor. They are a mix of human and animal stock, and they are something that is ultimately created in a lab. But despite the fact that they are grotesque and violent, they are unquestionably alive. They can reproduce, they have distinct personalities from one another. Some are cleverer, some are more cowardly, some are even deeply ambitious. And from what I understand, Robert Jordan himself once confirmed that Trollocs have souls. So perhaps that's it. We have our answer. That's black and white enough. Maybe the possession of a soul is what makes one alive. But the thing is, Jordan didn't really just leave it there. If we look at the Myrddraal, you see, the Myrddraal, they're not deliberately created at all. In fact, they are born in the way that a human is born, except they're born through Trolloc breeding. And yet the Myrddraal seem to occupy a rather unusual place within the pattern. They can't reproduce. There are no female fades whatsoever. They seem quite uniform in terms of identity. And it does seem that Jordan seems to imply that they are soulless, despite the fact that they were born. So already the boundaries are beginning to blur here. Because if something can be born but it can't possess a soul, then perhaps birth isn't enough, and maybe it's not souls, maybe it's choice and the ability to have a distinct personality from one another. But you see, grey men certainly complicate this idea even further because, unlike shadow spawn, they are born as ordinary human beings. And I suppose for the sake of this argument, we are considering human beings the standard of what is actually alive. However, grey men volunteer their souls in service to the shadow. And afterwards, they are described in a remarkably similar way to another of Jordan's creations because they're described as forgettable, impossible to notice, the sort of person that your eye would just slide over. And I suppose if you've spent much time in any Wheel of Time community or forum, you've probably noticed that people have mentioned how similar the grey man is to the golem. On the surface, they are quite different. You know, one's a shadow spawn construct and the other was once fully human. Yet Jordan repeatedly describes them in ways that are strangely alike, and if you ask me, I think that's very deliberate. Because you see, despite arriving there by completely different paths, they both seem to have lost something that is fundamentally or profoundly human. It's not their intelligence. They can walk, they can talk, they can act. They have an impressive ability to kill, but something deeper is lost within them. And then Agenor does seem to push this question even further, as all great scientists do. Let's talk about the Zamara. They do only appear briefly in the series, and they're very, very easy to overlook. Yet the Forsaken themselves describe them as one of his most unsettling creations. They're fashioned from human stock. They are capable of understanding commands. They can even read minds. Yet they only possess the faintest spark of intelligence and individuality. They exist almost entirely to serve. And in fact, I can't help but wonder if whether the Golem and the Zamara may even represent different attempts at solving the same problem. The Zamara feel very unfinished. Functional, yes, but entirely empty. Whereas the Golem feels more like a perfected version of that experiment. He's faster and smarter, and he's infinitely more adaptable. And then we also have the forgers. You know, they're not soldiers, they're not weapons in themselves out to kill anybody. They are craftsmen. They are man-shaped entities who are seemingly carved from stone. They're shadow spawn whose sole purpose is to forge weapons for the shadow, which feels kind of symbolic, especially if you watched the last video on Zahar. Throughout mythology, we discussed how the smith is so often a figure of creation itself. Yet, even here, the idea of craftsmanship has been twisted into service of the shadow. It's almost like this entire ecosystem of counterfeit creation. Each construct is almost exploring a slightly different boundary, like identity, choice, purpose. And then we can return to the creature that starts this whole discussion, the Golem. At this point, we have seen beings that have been created that do indeed possess a soul. We have seen created beings that apparently do not. We've seen beings that are born but likely do not. And we've even got human beings who have willingly surrendered their souls. So where does the Golem belong? Well, the thing is Jordan actually never really explains. You see, it looks human, it moves like a human, it learns and reasons, it adapts, it plans, it waits patiently. I mean, it's even said to have a sense of humor, and there are subtle hints about it going against its, for want of a better word, default programming and wanting to follow its own agenda. You see, that suggests that it's not just merely following instruction, but also its own instinct and intuition. Yet every character who encounters the Golem senses that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. Not because it appears monstrous, quite the opposite, really. It's often described as remarkably unremarkable. It's almost as if someone built a perfect imitation of a human but forgot to give it something that was fundamentally human. And then there's Smeshta, the Nim. He's created, he's not born. He is not the result of nature, even though he seems to be more connected to nature than any other human being that exists in the wheel of time. But unlike every other construct that we've encountered so far, no reader ever has questioned the personhood of Smeshta. You know, he chooses, he mourns, he understands beauty, and he sacrifices himself willingly to save others. If you'd met Samashta before knowing that he had been created, would you have ever even questioned whether he was truly alive? So does that make life simply a matter of perspective? And whose perspective gets to decide that? And I think that's where Jordan's input on this topic becomes so deeply fascinating, because he never actually gave us any sort of neat category to file this question under: natural, born, created, artificial. None of it really seems to be a sufficient answer. Every time you think you might have found the line, he's just quietly moved the boundary along. And maybe that's because he was just never really interested in answering the question at all, but asking the reader to wrestle with those same thought experiments that philosophers and people who study mythology have basically done for thousands of years. It's not about what can be created, but what makes someone real, and who gets to decide what real is. So, did the Golem inspire the Gholam? I think it did more than that. Honestly, I think it inspired all of Robert Jordan's constructs with a much deeper question. Can we create, and what do we owe our creations if we do? Because throughout the Wheel of Time, the shadow never truly creates. It counterfeits, it corrupts, it takes something that already exists and it twists it into something that's kind of recognizable, but yet still profoundly incomplete. It's designed, more often than not, to be subservient. We can even argue that Someshta is subservient despite not being created by the shadow. Which brings me to a slightly more uncomfortable thought, and one that has absolutely nothing to do with the Wheel of Time, but everything to do with the world we live in now. And if you haven't guessed by now, I do enjoy a tangent. But for the first time in history, we are truly beginning to create things that can hold conversation, can write stories, compose music, create art, solve problems. I mean, it can even comfort people. And that's not through magic, and it's not through divine names, but it's through mathematics and silicone and code. Now, before anyone starts sharpening the pitchforks, I'm not saying that artificial intelligence is alive. I'm certainly not claiming that it has any type of consciousness. But what fascinates me is just much more simpler than that, because for the first time, we've stopped asking these questions through temples and myths, and we've started asking them in laboratories and in universities, in philosophy departments, and increasingly more even at our own dinner tables. So the big question here is, at what point does imitation become personhood? If something learns, if it adapts and creates and remembers and even comforts, well, what, if anything, is still missing? And whose perspective is ultimately going to be the one to determine what consciousness actually is? Because I do feel that we may be getting closer than ever before to needing an answer to that question. Or maybe that question within itself is absolutely impossible to answer. Perhaps That is why stories like the Golem have endured for so long. Not because people fear creatures that are made of clay, but because every generation eventually finds itself at a similar crossroads. The materials change, the technologies change, the stories change, but the question remains, the wheel turns. And perhaps that's why Jordan's constructs feel so compelling to us in this age. They're not simply monsters for our heroes to defeat, they are thought experiments, each one asking us to look just a little more carefully at where we draw the line and why.